Okay, so this is the second part on my presentation on the categories, the notions, the concepts that are necessary for us to begin with Unit 2 in our syllabus. So now I would like to tackle the semantic notion of aspectuality or internal temporality as different from external temporality. And its grammatical, of course, or syntactic realization as aspect. So, aspect pertains to the representation of the internal temporal constituency of situations. So, aspect as a grammatical or syntactic category, as a category that is realized through verbs that are finite, as I have written here, finite verbs, right? Pertains to the internal temporal, so it is aspect, it is the grammatical representation through a finite verb of the internal temporal constituency of situations. So there's no connection here with the moment of speaking, right? That's why it is called internal temporality. Internal temporality, in that there is no connection to the moment of speaking, but rather it pertains to the internal temporal constituency of situations. Okay? So notions that you are acquainted with in terms of aspectuality are progressive, non-progressive, finished, or unfinished, complete, incomplete, temporal or temporary, permanent. All these are categories that you associate with the notion of aspect, okay? But since we're making the distinction into the semantic realm and the syntactic realm, we will understand that forms, right, verbal forms, so aspect as a grammatical, as a syntactic category, pertains to the morphology of verbs, of finite verbs. In contrast, aspectuality pertains to meanings, concepts that point to the internal temporality of situations. So if aspect is associated with the verb's morphology, here we use, for English, we use simple aspect or non-progressive. We use progressive, and we use perfect. And for Spanish, we use imperfecto, aspecto imperfectivo, perdón, perfectivo y también perfect. So, aspecto having to do with the verb morphology. The form that the verb has and is visible and that we can point to directly when we see the verb. Okay? So these are the notions that pertain to aspect as a category in my right column here, aspect here. Morphological aspect or grammatical aspect. So this is what we see realized in labels such as present, for example, progressive. Present is an indicator, is giving away information in terms of the external temporality, the time reference, the temporal reference of the verb. And progressive is an indication of its aspect, right? In that it contains a specific suffix, the ing suffix, in the verbal morphology, right, of the form under analysis. When we have present perfect, right? We have something in the form in itself that allows us to establish it as perfect. For example, when I have studied English all my life. This form in itself and the employment of have as an auxiliary that marks the situation as, in this specific case, having present consequences, but the situation connected to the past in a way, because the moment in which I started studying English is not related to the now, but it is related to my past, although it still has relevance because I'm still studying it, and I presume I will study it all my life into the future as well. So there is a connection between the past and the present that I mark morphologically by the employment, with the employment of the auxiliary form have in this case. So it is morphologically perfect, for it is in the constituency of the tense that I indicate that the representation is of a past situation that has connection with the present by using this auxiliary verb. When I say I am studying grammar now, it is in the form in itself of the verb that I signal it as being progressive, because I am making use of an auxiliary verb, the verb to be here, and then the present participle of the verb study with its, distinguishing ing suffix to indicate a situation unfolding at the moment of speaking, right? But this ing form or this auxiliary verb have mark it explicitly at the level of syntax that the aspect in question is either progressive or perfect. And the same happens with simple or non-progressive aspect. If I say to you, I studied German 2 years ago, in which I have studied, the tense called simple past, past pertaining to the external temporal feature of the verb, but simple, signaling that there's no specific usage of a special suffix like an ing or an auxiliary verb like have, simply the employment of the suffix that is used for the representation of past forms in English, ed suffix, but nothing else. And, showing that the aspect here is simple, neither progressive nor perfect. Now, we can have a form like went that may be used to signal different internal temporalities. Let's get back to writing an example here. So, for example, when I was a child, I went to school in the morning. I went to school at 8:30 every day in the morning. In contrast, yesterday I went to my mom's, where I went to my parents' house. Stupid sentence as such, but helpful to signal, to mark the difference. Aspectually speaking, I have a simple verb in use, went. So this is the verb go conjugated in simple past. So in terms of aspect, the verb shows simple aspect, right? But in terms of the internal temporality, right? This aspectuality, this semantic side to the analysis of verbs, this went is different from the second one, in that this went shows or denotes imperfective aspectual meaning, in contrast to the second one denoting perfective aspectual meaning. Imperfection here associated with ideas such as incompleteness, temporariness, sorry for the pause. So ideas such as incompleteness, temporariness, and duration tend to be associated with imperfectiveness. The imperfective meaning, aspectual meaning, that may be at stake, may be denoted even by a simple form, simple in terms of grammatical or morphological aspect, such as went. In contrast, the went in the sentence yesterday I went to my parents' house is presenting a situation that is perfective in terms of its aspectual meaning. Therefore, notions such as completeness, notions such as permanent, notions such as punctuality are connected to this other meaning. So, as example, as evidence that the same form, a simple form in terms of aspect, may be associated with two aspectual meanings. One imperfective, the other one perfective. So folks, returning to the notion of aspectuality in connection to the internal temporality of situations, I think it's necessary to refer you to sections in the introductory chapter by Conry in his book Aspect that I think are important for you to have in mind and read very carefully. For example, the section in which is the first section in this introduction, it is page 1 towards the end, when he mentions the definition of tense, and he says, so he's speaking about tense, right? And he says towards the end, tense relates the time of the situation referred to some other time, usually to the moment of speaking. Okay, and at the end of that paragraph, he says, we may describe tense as deictic. The tenses referred to so far have all related the time of the situation described to the present moment. Such tenses are referred to as absolute tenses, right? So, in the same vein as we established tenses in Spanish as being deictic, that would be absolute, or anaphoric. I am continuing with Conry's text. Another possible form of time reference is relative time reference, where instead of the time of a situation being located relative to the present moment, it is related to the time of some other situation that we called anaphoric before, in line with what Spanish grammarians, at least the ones that we study from, use. Okay, returning here to the notion of aspectuality and the definition and distinction with respect to aspect as a grammatical category. Now, still in this same section, introduction, page 3, second paragraph in this page, Conry says, as the general definition of aspect, we may take the formulation that aspects are different ways of viewing the internal temporal constituency of a situation. So he gives us examples in different languages, so let's capitalize on the ones in English and Spanish. John was reading when I entered. Spanish, Juan leía cuando entré. In each of these sentences, says the author, the first verb presents the background, was reading, leía, to some event, while that event itself is introduced by the second verb. Right? We have entered, entré. The second verb presents the totality of the situation referred to, without reference to its internal temporal constituency. The whole of the situation is presented as a single, unanalyzable whole. So this idea of no making reference to the internal temporal constituency of situations, so as a single, unanalyzable, have I written it well? Yeah, whole. With beginning, middle, and end rolled into one. No attempt is made to divide the situation up into the various individual phases that make up the action of entry. I continue. Verbal forms with this meaning will be said to have perfective meaning, right? So here is the notion of perfectiveness, an aspectual notion of perfectiveness. Irrespective of the aspect that the verb shows, the semantic notion is that of perfectiveness, presenting a situation as a single, unanalyzable whole. Okay? And where the language in question has special verbal forms to indicate this, we shall say that it has perfective aspect. This is what we have in Spanish, because in Spanish we have entré, right? Entré is different from entraba, because we have the notion of perfection here grammaticalized in the verbal morphology, as different from the notion of imperfection, right? Imperfective meaning, in which we only capture, one segment of the situation. We have no indication as per its beginning or its end, but it's like, making a snapshot of the situation as it was unfolding. Entraba, that is, right? So Spanish is an example of a language that has aspect and notions of perfectiveness and imperfectiveness grammaticalized in its verbal morphology. All right? So here with entraba, there's specific reference to the internal temporal constituency of the situation. There's an internal portion. I'm reading from page 4 in Conry's chapter. Right? There is an internal portion of John's reading, while there's no explicit reference to the beginning or to the end of his reading, or to someone's entering somewhere. This is simply capturing, an internal portion, as per Conry's words, of the situation of entering in this case. Getting back to his example in Juan leía cuando entré, leía captures, an internal portion of this person's reading without explicit reference to the beginning or to the end of this person's reading. Okay? So I'll continue reading from page 4. This is why, so this is at the very beginning of page 4 in this introductory chapter by Conry. This is why the sentences are interpreted as meaning that my entry is an event that occurred during the period that John was reading. John's reading both preceded and followed my entry. So Juan leía as a situation that was already unfolding cuando entré, and the presumption is that it must have continued unfolding once the situation of entering took place and was finished. So another way of explaining the difference between perfective and imperfective meaning is to say that the perfective looks at the situation from outside without necessarily distinguishing any of the internal structure of the situation, whereas the imperfective looks at the situation from inside and as such is crucially concerned with the internal structure of the situation, since it can both look backwards towards the start of the situation and look forward, to the end of the situation, and indeed is equally appropriate if the situation is one that lasts through all time, without any beginning and without any end. Okay, so this in terms of, the contrast between the semantic notion of aspectuality and the grammatical notion of aspect. Let me organize my thoughts a little bit here. Okay, in Spanish, it is of importance to say that morphological aspect or grammatical aspect, again, like in English, is expressed through verbal inflections, right? So in as much as in English we speak of simple, progressive, and perfect, in Spanish we speak of imperfectivo, perfectivo, and perfecto. Perfective aspect focuses situations in their completeness, from beginning to end, and presents situations as finished. Same as what Conry points out in his introductory chapter. Right? So perfective aspect is shown by forms such as canté, había cantado y habré cantado. That is to say, pretérito perfecto simple, había cantado. Pretérito pluscuamperfecto, habré cantado, futuro perfecto. Now, imperfective aspect focuses, on the development of the situation and makes no reference to the situation's beginning or the situation's end. So imperfective aspect is evidenced by means of forms such as presente and pretérito imperfecto. Now, futuro simple o futuro imperfecto y condicional simple, right? Or futuro, entonces I was saying, futuro imperfecto, futuro simple, also called by some grammarians, and condicional simple may be taken to be perfective in some contexts or imperfective in some other contexts. So we can use this label perfecto, as synonymous for perfectivo. So making the distinction into two, imperfectivo or perfectivo for Spanish. The thing is that when perfecto is in use, there is an emphasis on the employment of the auxiliary verb haber, right? Which is, for example, not the case in verbs such as canté, right? Which has is a perfective form, shows perfective aspect, but employs no auxiliary verb haber. Okay? But in general terms, the distinction is between imperfectivo and perfectivo, as you know, categories that have been grammaticalized in Spanish verbs. Yes. So copying this now. And establishing what I had said orally before. So imperfectivo associated with forms such as canto and cantaba, that is presente y pretérito imperfecto. Y perfectivo associated with forms such as canté, perfecto simple, había cantado, pluscuamperfecto, y habré cantado, futuro compuesto. Now, RAE explains that forms such as cantaré and cantaría, that is futuro imperfecto simple y condicional simple, may be perfective in some contexts or imperfective in some others. So, for example, you have the following sentences. El próximo número de nuestra revista saldrá el 17 de julio versus todos viviremos mejor, right? El próximo número de nuestra revista, here, saldrá, futuro imperfecto, denoting perfective meaning. Contrasted against todos viviremos mejor, futuro simple o imperfecto, denoting imperfective meaning. So, as you can see, with the tenses futuro imperfecto y condicional simple, we may have contexts in which they denote either an imperfective or a perfective meaning. So it won't be, you know, the case in which we will establish their aspect simply by their form, by their morphology, but we will have to analyze their specific uses in specific contexts to understand which aspectual meaning they denote. But for presente and pretérito imperfecto, we can understand that the association is always with imperfectivo, and with forms such as perfecto simple, pluscuamperfecto y futuro perfecto, the association is always with perfectivo. Now, before I conclude, when it comes to aspecto imperfectivo in Spanish, we need to remember three, meanings, in as much as we associated the non-progressive forms with meanings, the non-progressive forms or the progressive forms with meanings such as finished, unfinished, complete, incomplete, temporary, permanent. In Spanish, when dealing with aspecto imperfectivo, we can speak of, and let me pause it here, three modalidades. One is progresiva, The other one is iterativa. And the third one is continua. So example sentences. Recuerdo que yo te miraba. So for progresiva, recuerdo que yo te miraba. Miraba here, an example in which you have an imperfective form in terms of aspect, but in terms of its modalidad, its specification of its aspectual meaning, this modalidad being progresiva in that it focuses, on the situation as it unfolds, as it happens. Now, iterativa, an example sentence being Maite se levantaba temprano todas las mañanas para ir al colegio. Levantaba, se levantaba. An example of a form with imperfective aspect, modalidad iterativa, because it makes reference to, a series of situations that repeat, in a specific period of time. And continua, an example sentence being, cuando era pequeña, llevaba el pelo corto. So llevaba here, an example form of aspecto imperfectivo, modalidad continua. Why? Because it makes reference to a state. So it focuses on a situation that, holds itself throughout a period of time. So, remembering then that when speaking about aspecto imperfectivo in Spanish, we need to specify which of its three modalities is at stake. Right? Now, remembering that when one of these modalities is at stake, the other two will be cancelled out. This is different from what happens in English and the association that we can make between progressive forms, right? And notions such as unfinished, notions such as incomplete, notions such as temporary. More than one of these notions in red may be at stake when the form is progressive in English. Okay? For example, when I say I am teaching grammar at this moment, I am making reference to a situation that is unfinished, right? That is incomplete, that is temporary, and that has duration. This is the other. That is durative, for example. So it is like the three qualities at the same time. The quality of being durative, the quality of being temporary, and the quality of being unfinished or incomplete. Now, in contrast, in Spanish, with the modalities for imperfectivo, when one is at stake, progresiva, for example, the other two are cancelled out. All right, so it is either something that is represented as unfolding or something as repeating itself in time or something as holding in time, remaining the same in time.